What's up, everybody, and welcome back to First Fruits of Zion Reacts. We're going to be reacting in just a second here, but I wanted to remind you to check out the website at FFOZ.org, where if you possess the capacity to read, there is a lot more information there about understanding the Bible from a Messianic Jewish perspective, and we have lots of books in our store and such. So if you have questions, we have answers. But for now, we are reacting to this short video of a person who is having a street debate. So we will look and see what the parties here have to say and whether we can bring any clarity to the conversation.
Do you think not keeping the Sabbath is a sin?
As far as what Jesus said, even how Jesus healed a man's hand on the Sabbath, they were picking grain on the Sabbath. Later in the New Testament, it says, don't judge each other based on Sabbaths or feasts. And Jesus revealed that it's really about the matters of the heart, and it's really about love. Man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for men.
Well, he said a lot of things there in a short time. I hope I can remember all of them. So we do have disputes about the Sabbath in the New Testament. We have several of them. Picking grain on the Sabbath, healing a person on the Sabbath. These are two of the Sabbath controversies that we have in the New Testament between Jesus and some of the Pharisees. Some Pharisees. When you look at, first of all, the manuscript evidence that we have, the Gospels, it's noteworthy that if Jesus had taught his disciples, hey, you guys, I know it's one of the Big Ten, but you just don't have to worry about keeping the Sabbath anymore. All that matters is what's in your heart. All that matters is love. All you need is love. We would expect something different than what we find in the Gospel of Luke. At the very end, let me see if I can pull it up here. Luke chapter 23. After Jesus was buried, you can start in verse 54. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The day of preparation is another word for Friday, and it's called the day of preparation because by the end of Friday, you need to have prepared fully for the Sabbath, because there's a lot of things you can't do on the Sabbath. Start a fire and cook some food. You have to have all of that done. You have to have purchased everything that you need from the store. You can't, there's just the whole lot of things that are forbidden on the Sabbath. And you have to be prepared. You have to be prepared for the Sabbath. So Luke calls it the day of preparation. He says the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandment. And then in the start of chapter 24, it says, on the first day of the week at early dawn, they went to the tomb. So there seems to be a perception among some Christians that none of what Jesus said really made sense to any of his followers, and they just didn't get it. And I've even talked to people who said the apostles never got it. The apostles never understood. That's why Jesus had to call Paul to come and overturn the Old Testament law and everything that's in there, because the apostles just kept on keeping the Sabbath and meeting in the temple and participating in the sacrifices and all of that. I would like to propose a different view, which is that we do not have a very good idea of what Jesus is talking about. So let's bring up one of these Sabbath disputes. Matthew 12:1. Here's a good one. I think this is one of the ones he was talking about. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "I've come to abolish the Sabbath because you don't need to do that anymore, and it's all about what's in your heart." No, that's not what he said. Read it. He said, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I like this second example even better. So what is he saying? He's saying the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath. How do the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath? Well, there are 39 categories of proscribed activity on the Sabbath, the things you just can't do on the Sabbath because they constitute work. When it says in the Old Testament, the Sabbath is holy, don't do any work on the Sabbath day, work is kind of a broad term, right? So at some point you need to sit down and figure out, what did God mean by that? Was he using the word work like a physicist would use it? Well, probably not, because the word wasn't used that way in Old Testament times. So you have to figure out like a legal definition of work. Because remember, the Old Testament law is not just God saying to individual people, here's what I want you to do. It's a law code for a nation. It was enforced by the sword. It was the real law for a real country. So if you're going to adjudicate this commandment, don't do any work on the Sabbath day, you have to figure out what work is. And over some period of time, they've adjudicated the definition of the word work, and they said, well, there's 39 categories of stuff that we're going to call work, and you can go look those up. I don't have them all memorized because, well, we'll get to that. We'll get to why I don't have those things memorized. Maybe I should, but I don't. So some of the things the priests have to do to fulfill their duties to God as he commanded, because God commanded for lots of things to happen in the temple. There's the daily offering, and on the Sabbath there's an additional offering. And so there's mandatory sacrifices that have to happen in the temple. And some of the things that you have to do in order to facilitate this animal sacrifice is considered work under Jewish law. However, the priests go ahead and do it anyway because it's what God commanded. Jesus says here, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath. So that's a really interesting way to put it. He could have said something like, well, the priests have an exception, so they're not really breaking the Sabbath. And he says, because they are. They're breaking the Sabbath. Why are they allowed to do that? Well, there's a greater concern. There's a greater concern, greater even than Sabbath observance. Sabbath is important. It's like a sign of the covenant between God and Israel. The guy, remember the guy who was picking up sticks there in the Old Testament, and Moses said, God, what do we do with this guy who was picking up sticks on the Sabbath? And God said, kill him, right? So you can die for this. This is a commandment that with apparently extreme gravity to keep the Sabbath. It's a testimony to the nations that God created the world in 7 days or 6 days and rested on the seventh day. And to protect that testimony, the commandment to keep the Sabbath, rest and do no work on the Sabbath is guarded very closely. And it's a mark of being an observant Jew. It's someone's Shomer Shabbos. Someone keeps the Sabbath. That's almost like shorthand for someone who keeps the commandments of God. It's important. It's emblematic of Jewish observance. And yet, there's a greater concern in the case of sacrifices in the temple, because you have to keep those sacrifices coming. It was more important than keeping the Sabbath. Similarly, with David and his men who were hungry, they ate the bread of the presence. Totally forbidden. However, there was a greater concern at play. So Jesus' argument here is in verse 6, there's something greater than the temple is here. And so apparently his argument is that there's a greater concern at play than keeping the Sabbath. That doesn't mean that there's no such thing as the Sabbath anymore. It does not mean that that the commandment is canceled. He said something completely different from that. He said something completely different from the Sabbath is canceled. It's never a bad time to go to Matthew 5, verse 17, and say, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So we can expect that Jesus would be keeping the Sabbath. His disciples go on keeping the Sabbath, as we read in Luke. Are matters of the heart important? Well, yes. Is love important? Of course it is. When someone asked Jesus, what is the most important commandment? He said the most important commandments from Deuteronomy 6, to love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your mind and all of your strength. And the second commandment is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two commandments hang the rest of the law and the prophets. The issue is, though, like, when you, for example, and let's use marriage as an example, because I think marriage is a pretty good example because it's also like a covenant relationship. When you marry someone, you're saying to them, look, I'm going to be faithful, right? I'm not going to have this kind of relationship that we have with anyone else. I'm not going to be running around behind your back. I'm not going to even entertain the idea. I'm not going to be flirting with other people. I'm going to remain faithful. And you think about it, that's a pretty severe limitation. Of all the billions of people on the planet, this type of relationship, you're restricting yourself to one person. And that's a hard and fast rule. So, as a New Testament writer might say, even among the Gentiles, right? Even like culturally and across different cultures, when you make that kind of commitment, it's taken very seriously. And if you break that commitment, if you break that rule, that you can even call it, a law of that relationship, it's devastating to the relationship and can lead to the dissolution of the relationship because of how damaging it is to the relationship. Similarly, when Jesus says to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, part of loving God is keeping the demands of the covenant with God. He's talking to Jews who are party to the Sinai covenant. They have a covenant with God with 613 commandments. And that sounds like a lot, but that's what God gave them. That's what he desired. And they said, yes, everything that you've commanded us, we will do. So the Sabbath is one of those commandments. Keep the Sabbath, honor the Sabbath, remember the Sabbath, don't do any work on the Sabbath. So if a Jewish person were to say, well, it's important to love God, and I just want to love God with all my heart, but I'm not going to keep the demands of the covenant. It's all about the love. Well, it's the same. It's pretty much the same thing as saying, well, I love my spouse. I love my spouse. I'm not going to remain faithful to them. I'm going to go have intimate relationships with other people also, because really it's only about the love. I just love my spouse. It doesn't impact my love at all in my heart that I have for them. Well, part of loving someone, if you're in a covenant relationship with them, is adhering to the demands of that covenant. So saying that it's about love, well, sure, it's about love, but I think we need to understand what love means in the context of a covenant relationship. You can't just say you love someone or feel love for someone, although those things are important. The faithfulness is also important. It's an important component of a relationship like that. As far as the Sabbath being made for man, and not man for the Sabbath, sure. But what does that mean? I think we can say there may be an allusion there even to what Jewish teachers today also teach about the Sabbath, which is that keeping the Sabbath shouldn't kill you, right? The Sabbath is for you. The Sabbath shouldn't be the type of restriction that is so onerous that you will die because of it. Like, it's for you. It's for your benefit. Like, it's supposed to be helpful to you. It's supposed to be good for you. That's the case with all the commandments. There's a principle in Jewish law called pikuach nefesh, which means you can break pretty much any law of the Torah in order to save a life. There's a few that you can't, but most of them you can. Like Sabbath is a classic example in Jewish law. If someone needs medical attention on the Sabbath or they'll die, it's mandatory. It's not optional. It's mandatory under Jewish law that they should receive that medical attention. So doctors are working on the Sabbath. An ambulance driver is going to be working on the Sabbath. Like Jesus said, they're profaning the Sabbath. They're doing things that are forbidden on the Sabbath. But there's a greater concern at play, because the Sabbath is made for us. It's made for our benefit, and it should be helpful to us. Now, I'm talking about a Jewish person's relationship with the Sabbath and with God. The apostles did not say, when you think of Paul and Peter and James and the rest, they did not say to Gentile followers of Jesus, you guys also You guys, just like the Jewish people from time immemorial, you guys also now have the same relationship with the Sabbath. And your obligation under Jewish law to the laws of Shabbat are exactly the same as those of a Jewish person. They did not say that. So when we look at a conversation like this, that topic generally doesn't come up. And it's this binary like, well, is there Sabbath or is there not Sabbath? And it's actually a little more nuanced than that. There definitely is Sabbath. And I think a Gentile follower of Yeshua, there's a lot we can do to honor the Sabbath and remember the Sabbath. And it's an important day. We can also have a testimony to the nations that God, our God, the one God, the God of Israel, created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. We can have that testimony also by doing something special for the Sabbath. But we don't have the same obligations as a Jewish person would to the Sabbath. All that being said, Jesus did not cancel the Sabbath. He had arguments with the Pharisees about whether certain things were permissible or forbidden on the Sabbath. But that's very different from canceling the Sabbath.
So you're saying we shouldn't follow the fourth commandment?
Jesus just said man's not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath is made for man. Was Jesus sinning when he did that?
No, he wasn't, because he kept the Sabbath. But
Right.
he did good things on Sabbath. He still kept the Sabbath.
No. Right.
Well, no. It's yes, because she's right. Everything she said there is right. He did things on the Sabbath that were good, like when he did his healing, right? He did good things and was a conduit for God's healing power and grace and to come into the world on the Sabbath. And he thought that's totally permissible on the Sabbath, and that there were Pharisees who disagreed, and they argued about that. But the argument was over whether that particular thing was permissible on the Sabbath. According to Jesus and what he thought about what he was doing, he was keeping the Sabbath. What his actions were in total concordance with Jewish law, according to him. There were people who disagreed, and they argued about it. But again, the conversation was not about whether anyone should keep the Sabbath. That was not up for debate. So she's right here. And this idea that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, it's just not the same thing as saying there's no Sabbath anymore. Can you see that? Can you see how the sentence, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, does not in any way grammatically imply at all that there's no Sabbath? Sabbath is mentioned twice in the sentence.
Right there, they're accusing him for doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath. That's what the religious people were accusing him of. If you're sticking with what you're saying and not what Jesus said, then you're calling Jesus a sinner. Do you guys think Jesus is a sinner?
No.
Okay.
Well, that's not quite right. So actually what seems to be happening here is this fella is agreeing with the Pharisees in the argument between Jesus and the Pharisees, where Jesus is saying, I'm not breaking the Sabbath. What I'm doing is permissible on the Sabbath. He's agreeing with the Pharisees who said he was breaking the Sabbath. And I don't think that's correct. I think we should side with Yeshua, who said what he was doing was permissible because there was an overriding concern, which is fully legitimate argument within Judaism to say, well, there's a more important commandment at play here. A more important biblical idea or Torah commandment is at play here that overrides the Sabbath in this case. So yeah, let's not agree with the Pharisees and say that Jesus was sinning and breaking the law. Let's take his side of the argument and say that the Sabbath is still important, and the laws of the Sabbath are still in force for everyone under the Sinai covenant. However, Jesus did not break those laws. He didn't. He disagreed with some of the other Pharisees, some of the Pharisees about what was permissible and forbidden on the Sabbath. Well, I hope you learned something today about the Sabbath and about Jesus' disputations with the Pharisees. It's okay to argue. It's okay to argue about the Bible, to have different interpretations and hash it out. And we see that happening in the New Testament all the time. Well, don't forget to go to FFOZ.org. We will give you something for free if you create an account. So go ahead and do that. You'll learn a lot, and hopefully you'll be edified from learning the Bible from a Messianic Jewish perspective. And that being said, I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.